Good afternoon. My name is Jorg Massen, and I'm happy to talk to you today about how we can study the evolution of cooperation and prosociality in birds. I'm generally very interested in animal cooperation, but more specifically, I'm interested in how these cooperative tendencies among animals evolved and how it has led us humans to become so cooperative that we can actually collaborate on an international space station. Generally, when we look at the evolution of specific socio-cognitive traits and want to compare ourselves to animals, we compare ourselves to our closest living relatives, like, for example, chimpanzees. But I would like to argue today that it might be also worthwhile to study more distantly related species in these socio-cognitive traits. And to do that, I first want to introduce you to my partner in crime, my cooperative partner in this endeavor, which has been, for most of the studies, Thomas Buchner, here from Vienna. And if we take Thomas as an example, and we see a specific socio-cognitive trait in Thomas, and we also see this among, for example, chimpanzees, this tells us something about this evolutionary history of this socio-cognitive trait, namely that it most likely was already present in our common living ancestor, which lived about 4 to 13 million years ago. Although very interesting, of course, this doesn't tell us much about the why. So why did this specific behavior evolve? And that is because we know very little about this common ancestor. We know very little about its socio-ecology, so we don't really get an answer about the selection pressures that might have led to the evolution of this trait. To answer that question, it's more interesting to look at more distantly related species, like, for example, birds, whom we share an ancestor that lived about 320 million years ago, and as I've been told, looks a bit like this. If we see traits in specific bird species and, for example, the hominids, we can assume convergent evolution, so independent evolution in these two lineages, because if the common ancestor already possessed that trait, then all living descendants should show this specific trait, and generally, especially when we're talking about complex socio-cognitive traits, this is not the case. So we really look at convergent evolution, and then if we see evolution in these parallel lines, we can ask the question, what about the social ecology of these two lineages might inform us about why it evolved? All right, so when we look at specific bird species, we tend to look at those with relatively big brains. But if we take this raven as an example, it has the brain size of a walnut, which is not specifically large, you might think. However, it's all about the comparison to body size. And this is what a nice study by Olkowicz and colleagues. What they nicely show here is the body mass and the brain mass on the y-axis, and we see a very clear relationship between body and brain mass. But it's interesting to see that some of these lines lie a little bit higher than the others. That is, of these taxa, the brain sizes are relatively big in comparison to their body sizes. And we see this for the primates, the blue on the top. But if we zoom in, we actually see that songbirds and parrots are on a similar line as primates are. And then if we zoom in even further, and we see that among those songbirds, there are especially the corvids that have relatively big brains for their body size. So this led me to study cooperation in a corvid species, namely the raven. And to do so, we made use of a paradigm that has been tested in primates too, which is the loose string paradigm, in which two individuals have to cooperate to move a tray towards their fence such that they can get the rewards, which you can nicely see here. You can also nicely see that the string is loose. And with this paradigm, we could show that ravens actually detect cheaters as soon as they're being cheated on. And with a different paradigm, we could also show that they memorize these cheaters at least for over a month. In different setups of the same paradigm, we could test the understanding of the need for a partner of these ravens, and we see that they learn this over time and they really understand the need, that they can coordinate with their partner when they have two different of these paradigms in front of them. But the most prominent result that we found is that social tolerance predicts cooperative success in these paradigms. And this is a finding that we could nicely replicate in a parrot species, namely the Kia. So also the Kia showed more and more efficient cooperation with partners and with whom they share and have high social tolerance, and also the Kia were able to detect cheaters. A big question that remained for me was, so what initiates these cooperative interactions? So what is the mechanism behind the initiation of these cooperative interactions? And in human literature, then it's often referred to prosociality. So the prosocial tendencies of specific individuals may enhance cooperative interactions in humans. Interestingly, however, this is rarely tested and has never been tested before in animals. So we took it upon us to test this in animals, and this is the only primate study I'm going to present in this presentation because we did this on common marmosets. And what we did is we subjected these common marmosets to the same paradigm I showed before, so the loose string paradigm, the cooperative paradigm, but we also subjected them to a prosociality paradigm, which I'm going to explain in a bit for the bird studies. But here you just have to believe me that with this paradigm, we can test prosocial tendencies in specific individuals. And what we found very nicely is if we have a diet that contains at least one prosocial individual that has shown to be very, very prosocial in the prosociality task, then we see that successful cooperation on your y-axis here increases almost by twofold. What we also nicely see is that over experimental sessions, all diets become more effective in cooperating, but still we see this twofold increase as soon as a diet contains a prosocial individual. So then we had a look at prosociality in the corvids and specifically the ravens. And interestingly, using several different paradigms, we found no evidence for prosocial preferences among ravens. Then we went on to test yet another paradigm, and now specifically in Azure-winged magpies, another corvid species. And this is the seesaw paradigm, which I referred to before, and which I'm going to talk about the rest of this talk. So what you see here are these Azure-winged magpies on a seesaw. So they can land on the perch, which tilts the seesaw, and then food that is normally placed out of their reach at the end of the tray rolls towards the fence, such that it becomes available for the Azure-winged magpies. Importantly, however, so you see on your right the paradigm from above. In the test situation, we put the food in position 1. So as soon as a bird lands on the perch, the food becomes available, but not to the individual on the perch because it's out of reach. And if it leaves the perch, the seesaw tilts back in its original position and the food rolls back out of reach again. So the only thing the bird can do is sit and wait for a conspecific to take the reward. Long story short, video. So here we nicely see an Azure-winged magpie landing on the perch and waiting for a conspecific to grab the reward, thus being prosocial. And if we do this over multiple sessions, and here each session has 25 trials. On your y-axis, you see the number of trials with landings, and the solid line represents the test condition. We see that these Azure-winged magpies take any opportunity to provide food to their conspecifics. And they do this also significantly more often in this test situation in comparison to the control situations, which were either no food or a blocked control in which the partner also could not get access to the food. So you nicely see that over these 5 sessions in these control situations, the number of landings decrease. So the birds slowly start to get an understanding that in these situations, it doesn't pay off for anyone. And we found that even after half a year in a retest, they still show the same behavior. So they are truly prosocial. So are the Azure-winged magpies then the prosocial corvid? And might this be because these Azure-winged magpies, in fact, are cooperatively breeding corvids. That is, it's not just a mom and dad that take care of their offspring, it's also offspring of the previous year, but often also even unrelated individuals that help raise offspring, which is similar to how we humans raise our offspring. It takes a village to raise a child, and it has been proposed that this cooperative breeding mechanism might be the cause for heightened prosocial tendencies. And the question now is that the same in corvids here? Do we see these heightened prosocial tendencies in the Azure-winged magpies because they are cooperative breeders, or might there be other reasons for that? Well, first, when we tested these Azure-winged magpies in a food sharing condition, we could show that their decisions to share food are contingent on the presence or absence of food for the recipients. Basically, this means that they really cater to the need of their conspecifics. And in a more complex task in Goffin cockatoos, we could show that the individual Goffin cockatoos show flexible target helping in a tool transfer task. So they really provided their conspecific with the right tool for the right task. So there were different tools and different tasks, but they understood which tool their conspecific needed. And so they really helped their conspecifics there. So relatively complex tasks can even be solved. Complex helping tasks can even be solved by birds. Interestingly, however, when we tested the Azure-winged magpies in the original paradigm, in which we also tested the ravens, and we tested magpies here, but also carrion crows, again, we found no evidence for prosocial preferences. So we nicely see that also the paradigm in which you test your species is of great importance, and we concluded here that this actual paradigm might have been cognitively too complex for these corvids. But then we still don't really have an answer why these Azure-winged magpies were so prosocial in the original task, and whether this is because they are cooperative breeding species. These Azure-winged magpies are also colonial species, and it might be that because they live in these colonies, they have to reduce their aggression towards conspecifics, which has been referred to as the self-domestication hypothesis. So that might also be a reason why they showed these heightened prosocial tendencies, at least in the task in which we tested them. To truly get our fingers behind what caused the heightened prosocial tendencies of these Azure-winged magpies, we compared them to seven other corvid species, and we did that in the same task as we tested these Azure-winged magpies before. That is the seesaw task I explained to you previously. And we chose specifically these 8 corvid species because 2 of them were cooperative breeders and 3 of them were colonial nesting species, whereas the other were territorial pair-bonded species. And what we found is that indeed cooperative breeding predicts the number of landings in the prosocial test. That is, cooperatively breeding species were more prosocial than non-cooperatively breeding species. We also found an effect of colonial nesting, that is that specifically the males of colonial nesting species show heightened prosocial tendencies in comparison to females of these colonial species, but also in comparison to territorial species. So both cooperative breeding and colonial nesting, which may both rely on heightened social tolerance at the nest, are likely evolutionary pathways to prosocial behavior in corvids and maybe a more general. And to test that, I've expanded my view and I'm now looking at parrots, and have recently tested rosé cockatoos, also referred to as gala, which are gregarious and colonial, and eclectus parrots, which is in fact a cooperatively breeding parrot species. These results are really fresh, so I got them in last week. And what we find is that both species show relatively high prosocial tendencies, but we do not find significant difference between the 2 species in their prosocial tendencies. But as in the corvids, we now have a cooperative breeding and a communal breeding species, and we should compare that to parrot species that don't show either cooperative breeding or communal breeding. So to truly get a better idea, this parrot prosociality project needs to be continued. All right, that was my talk. I would like to thank all my collaborators, so Thomas and also Lisa, which did most of these studies here, and many others. I would like to thank the universities that worked at, the bird zoo where I'm currently working, the funding agencies, some more international collaborators, and you for your attention. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed my talk.